The train from Cheyenne was 40 minutes late, which meant the small crowd gathered at Harlow Creek's single-platform station had been standing in the October wind long enough to lose patience and most of their good humor. Ranchers shifted their weight. A general store owner checked his pocket watch twice in 5 minutes. Two women near the far end of the platform had already retreated to the shade of the depot's narrow overhang, fanning themselves against a cold that didn't quite warrant fanning but gave their hands something to do. Silas Boone stood apart from all of them, the way he usually stood, close enough to be present, far enough to make clear he wasn't interested in conversation. He was there because his foreman, a heavy-set man named Dutch Greer, had ordered a delivery of feed supplies from the rail freight office, and Dutch's bad knee had kept him off his horse for 2 weeks running. So Silas had come himself. He was not a man who complained about such things. He put on his coat, rode into town, and waited, same as anyone else. He was 34 years old and looked it in the way that working men look their age. Not worn out exactly, but settled into the weight of everything they'd carried. His hands were rough. There was a scar along his left jaw from a fence post that had kicked back wrong 7 years ago. He kept his dark hair cut short and his beard closer than most men bothered with on the frontier, not out of vanity, but because Caleb had once told him the scruff scratched when they hugged, and Silas had gone home that afternoon and shaved. Caleb, his son, was sitting on the edge of the freight cart behind him, legs dangling, kicking his heels against the wood with a patience that exceeded most adults Silas knew. The boy was 5 years old, small for his age, with a head of dark curls that needed cutting and eyes that were a particular shade of brown. Not Silas's dark brown, but something warmer, lighter, a color that had no business appearing in the Boone family line. Silas had stopped thinking about where that color came from, or tried to. "Papa," Caleb said, "is the train going to be real long still?" "Don't know." Dutch said the Cheyenne train's always late. Dutch is usually right about things like that. Caleb considered this with the seriousness of a small judge weighing testimony. "Is Dutch right about the weather too? He said it's going to snow before the end of the month." "Dutch says a lot of things. But is he right?" Silas looked at the sky, heavy and white at the edges, the kind of flat gray that had more in it than it was letting on. "Probably," he said. Caleb seemed satisfied. He went back to kicking his heels. The train whistle sounded from around the eastern bend, and the platform stirred back to life. People straightened up, stepped forward, shielded their eyes against the mid-morning glare. The locomotive came in with more noise than drama, hissing and clanking into the station with the graceless authority of something very large moving very slowly. Steam rolled across the platform. Someone coughed. Silas stayed where he was and waited for the freight car. He almost missed her entirely. She came off the second passenger car after an elderly couple, after a man in a city suit with a sample case, after a young woman traveling alone who kept her eyes on the ground. She came down the steps carefully, one hand on the rail, and for a moment she just stood at the bottom and looked at the town, at the dust, the storefronts, the line of cottonwoods at the edge of Main Street stripped bare by autumn, as if she was trying to decide whether Wyoming was as bad as she remembered, or worse. The dress was the first thing people noticed. White, or it had been white, with a high collar that was buttoned crooked and lace along the cuffs that had been torn and knotted back together with thread of a slightly different color, the kind of repair you made yourself in poor light when you didn't have proper materials. The skirt was heavy with road grime from the knee down. The left shoulder seam gaped where something had pulled it apart. She was carrying nothing. No traveling case, no bag, nothing except a folded envelope held against her chest with both hands, the way you'd carry something fragile or something you were afraid someone would take. She was not beautiful in any way the town would have agreed on. Not small, not delicate, not the kind of woman who made men straighten their backs without meaning to. She was medium height, a little soft around the middle in a way that frontier women usually weren't. Frontier life carved everything off you eventually. With brown hair that had been pinned up and was losing the battle, strands coming free around her face in the wind. Her face was the face of someone who had slept badly for a long time. There were shadows under her eyes deep enough to be bruises, and her mouth was set in a line that wasn't quite calm and wasn't quite afraid. It was her eyes that stopped you, if you looked long enough. They moved constantly, taking inventory. The platform, the faces, the street beyond, the freight wagons, the depot windows. The eyes of someone who had learned to always know where the exits were. Most of the crowd glanced at her and looked away. A wedding dress alone in a strange town was the kind of thing that invited speculation and then embarrassment, and frontier people generally preferred to stay out of other people's disasters. It was Caleb who changed that. The boy had slid off the freight cart the moment the train arrived, threading between adult legs the way small children do, drawn by noise and movement and the pure magnetism of anything new. He had gotten halfway down the platform when he stopped. Silas didn't see it happen. He was already moving toward the freight office to check on the delivery. He heard the sound before he understood it. His son's voice, clear and certain, cutting through the platform noise like a bell through fog. "That's my mama." Silas turned. Caleb was standing 6 feet from the woman in the torn dress, one arm extended, pointing. His expression was not surprised. It was not confused. It was the expression of someone who has recognized something they had been trying to find for a very long time and has found it exactly where they always somehow believed it would appear. The woman had gone absolutely still. She was staring at Caleb with the kind of attention that stops everything. All the platform noise, all the wind, all the ordinary sounds of a Tuesday morning, and when her face broke, it broke completely and without warning. Her mouth opened and she pressed one hand over it, and the sealed envelope fell out of her grip and hit the planks. And she didn't reach for it. She didn't look at it. She looked at the boy and nothing else. "Caleb," she said. It came out barely above a whisper, rough at the edges, like a word she'd said 10,000 times in private and had almost stopped believing she'd ever say out loud again. Silas crossed the platform in 7 steps. He put his hand on Caleb's shoulder, firm, automatic, the gesture of a man inserting himself between his child and something unknown, and looked at the woman, and for one complete unmeasured second, the world simply stopped making sense. He knew her face. He had tried for 4 years not to know it anymore. He had built walls against it, room by room, the way you board up a house for winter, methodical, necessary, survivable. He had told himself that those walls had held. He had been wrong. "Evelyn," he said. It wasn't a greeting, it wasn't a question. It was just the word, sitting there between them like something neither of them knew what to do with. Evelyn Harper, Evelyn Boone, for the 11 months she had been his wife, was standing on the platform of Harlow Creek Station, Wyoming, in a destroyed wedding dress, 4 years after she had disappeared without explanation or warning or goodbye. She looked at him the way people look at something they've been afraid to see, and there was relief in her face and grief in it simultaneously, the two things living in the same space the way they sometimes have to. "Silas," she said. Around them, the platform had gone quiet. In that specific way small towns go quiet when something worth watching is happening. Nobody made a noise. Nobody moved away. "Mama," Caleb said, with a conviction that made 2 or 3 people on the platform look away because their eyes had gotten inconvenient. Todd. Silas did not invite her to the ranch that day. He wasn't even sure. Standing there on the platform with Caleb's hand in his and his ex-wife 3 feet away looking like she'd been through something terrible, what the correct response was supposed to be. There were no rules for this. Nothing in his experience, not losing his father at 17, not the drought of 1887, not the fever that had nearly taken Caleb 2 years ago, had prepared him for the particular problem of a woman coming back from the dead. What he did was take Caleb's hand very firmly, pick up the envelope from the platform planks. He didn't give it to her, just picked it up, and tell Evelyn that she should go get herself a room at the Harlow Inn, that she looked like she needed to sit down, and that they would talk. Not today. He said that clearly. Not today. She didn't argue. That surprised him. The Evelyn he remembered had never been a woman who didn't argue when she had something to say, and whatever had happened to her in 4 years, she seemed to have a great deal to say. But she just nodded, once, and reached for the envelope, and he handed it over. Their fingers didn't quite touch. He made sure of that. He took Caleb and left. The ride back to the Boone Ranch took 40 minutes on a clear day. Silas made it in 35, pushing the horse more than he should have, and didn't notice until they were past the creek crossing, and Caleb said quietly, "Papa, you're going fast." Silas slowed down. "Sorry," he said. Caleb was sitting in front of him on the saddle, his small back against Silas's chest, the way they'd ridden since before the boy was old enough to manage his own horse. He didn't say anything for a moment, then, "That was my mama." "I know." "You know her?" "Yes." Another pause. The horse moved at a walk now, and the wind had died down, and the prairie on either side of the road was quiet and brown and enormous, the way Wyoming prairie always was in October. Beautiful if you'd grown up with it, crushing if you hadn't. "Why doesn't she live with us?" Caleb asked. Silas had known this question was coming. He'd known it was coming from the moment he heard his son's voice on the platform. He had not, in the 40 minutes since, arrived at an answer that was both honest and appropriate for a 5-year-old. "She went away," he said, "a long time ago." "Why?" "I don't know yet." Caleb processed this. "Are you going to find out?" "Maybe. I think you should," Caleb said, with the particular certainty of small children who have not yet learned that some things are complicated enough to resist conclusion. She looked sad. Silas kept his eyes on the road. "Yeah," he said. "She did." That night, after Caleb was asleep, Silas sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee gone cold and tried to reconstruct what he actually knew, as opposed to what he had spent 4 years believing. What he knew: Evelyn Harper had come to Wyoming in the spring of 1886, traveling with her father, Aldous Harper, a railroad investment man from Boston who had interests in the territory. Silas had met her at the Lindstrom Barn dance in May. He had not intended to fall in love with her. It had happened anyway, the way most serious things happen. Not all at once, but steadily, without his permission. They had married in October of that year. 11 months later, she was gone. He had woken on a September morning to find her side of the bed cold, and her things, some of them, not all, missing. No note, no explanation, nothing except a peculiar, unsettled silence in the house that had never quite left, even after 4 years. He had looked for her. He wanted that on record, even if the only record was his own accounting. He had written to her father in Boston. Aldous Harper had written back with the smooth regret of a man who practiced that tone. "Deeply sorry. Evelyn has always been troubled. I'm afraid she suffered a kind of breakdown. She is in the care of physicians. It would be best for everyone if you moved forward with your life." The letter had been courteous and impenetrable and entirely final in its intention. Silas had written a second letter, no reply. He had consulted a lawyer in Cheyenne about his options. The lawyer had been frank with him. Aldous Harper was a wealthy man with connections to territorial judges. A working rancher in Harlow Creek with no money for a prolonged legal fight had essentially no practical recourse. He could petition for divorce on grounds of abandonment, which he eventually did, the paperwork grinding through the system with the speed of cold molasses until it was finally settled 2 years later, or he could accept the situation and raise his son. He had done both. For 4 years, he had operated on the assumption that his wife had left him, that she had made a choice for reasons he would never fully understand, and that the only decent thing to do was build something out of what remained. He had built something, a working ranch, a son who was more or less intact, a life that was not the one he'd planned, but was real and his and functional. And now she was at the Harlow Inn in a torn wedding dress, and his 5-year-old son had recognized her on sight, and Silas was sitting at his kitchen table at 11 o'clock at night, trying to figure out how furious he was allowed to be, and how much of that fury might not be entirely earned. He picked up the coffee cup, set it back down, looked at the ceiling. He didn't sleep much. She came to the ranch 3 days later. Not uninvited exactly. He had sent word through Molly Greer, Dutch's wife, who had taken it upon herself to visit Evelyn at the inn on that first day and had come back with the complicated expression of a woman who had heard something that rearranged her opinions. Silas hadn't asked what Evelyn had told her. He'd simply sent word that she could come on Thursday at 10 in the morning and that Caleb would be there. He hadn't said, "I'll hear you out." He hadn't said, "I believe you." He had said Caleb would be there, which was all the invitation that was genuinely his to offer. The rest was still being decided. She arrived on a horse borrowed from the livery, which told him something about her practical sense at least. The morning was cold enough for breath to show, and she was wearing a coat that was plain and dark and several years old and fit her well, which meant it was probably hers. No wedding dress this time. She looked less like a disaster and more like a person, which was both better and harder to manage. Caleb had been watching out the window since 9:30 and had the door open before she'd finished tying the horse. "Mama," he said, and ran across the porch and down the steps, and Evelyn dropped to her knees in the dirt before he reached her. Not gracefully, Just fast, the way you do when the thing you've been waiting for finally arrives and you're not thinking about your knees, and caught him when he hit her, and held on. She held on for a long time. Silas watched from the doorway. He kept his face neutral. He had always been good at that. When she finally stood, slowly, one hand on her knee, the way people do when they're stiff or their joints are older than their years, she looked up at him across the yard. She didn't ask permission to come in, but she waited. He stepped back from the door. The kitchen was the least formal room in the house, which was why he took her there instead of the front sitting room, where the furniture was better and the air was stiffer. Dutch's wife had been in the day before, and there was a pie on the counter, apple, which Caleb had already excavated one slice from and was eyeing a second one. Silas poured coffee without asking if she wanted it. She wrapped both hands around the cup like someone who hadn't been warm in a while. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me yet." He sat down across from her. Caleb positioned himself beside his mother with the casual certainty of someone who had already made his decision and wasn't looking for input. "You said you'd explain. So explain." She had brought the envelope again. It sat on the table between them, still sealed, which confused him briefly until she pushed it toward him without opening it herself. "That's not mine to open," she said. "It's yours." He looked at it. His name was on the outside, written in handwriting he didn't recognize. Neat, formal, the script of someone educated or trained for legibility. The envelope was sealed with wax red, no stamp or insignia. "What is it?" "A letter I wrote to you," she said, 4 years ago, 2 weeks after I disappeared." He looked up at her. "I didn't send it," she said. "I couldn't. But I want you to read it before I say anything else, because I don't—" She stopped, took a breath. "I don't want to tell you what happened, and have you sit there thinking I'm making it up. The letter exists, it's dated. I want you to see it." "How do I know you didn't write it last week?" It was a hard thing to say. He said it anyway. She didn't flinch exactly, but something moved through her face. "You don't," she said. "Not yet. But the woman who kept that letter for 4 years in the hope that she'd one day be sitting in this kitchen—" She stopped again. "I'm asking you to read it, Silas. That's all I'm asking right now." He picked up the envelope. The wax broke cleanly. Inside was a single folded page, written front and back in the same neat, legible hand, the ink slightly faded at the edges and in the folds. Not freshly done, not recently aged, but genuinely old in the way paper gets, when it's been folded and handled and kept, and not looked at because looking at it would make the writer remember too clearly what she'd been when she'd written it. He read it. He read it twice. Caleb, who had been eating apple pie with studied casualness, put down his fork. The letter was dated September 14th, 1887, 11 days after Evelyn had disappeared. It was addressed to Silas. It began, "I don't know if this will ever reach you. I'm writing it because if I don't put it somewhere outside my own head, I think I will lose my mind entirely. My father had me taken from your house. I want you to know that first, before anything else. I did not leave. I was taken." It went on for 2 full pages in that vein. Not hysterical, not overwrought, but precise in the way that people become precise when they're describing something so terrible that they're afraid of being disbelieved, and so they stick to facts. Dates, names, locations, as best she knew them. The name of the physician in Boston to whom she had been delivered and who had classified her, at her father's instruction, as mentally unfit for independent living. The name of the house where she had been kept, which was not a hospital but a private estate in Connecticut, staffed with people whose employment depended on her staying put and staying quiet. She had written about Caleb once in the letter, in a single sentence near the end. "I think about my son every day. I think about him when I wake up and when I try to sleep and in every hour between. I don't know if you will let him know I exist. I hope you will. I hope someday he will know that I did not leave him by choice, and that I have never, not for one single day, stopped trying to find a way back." Silas set the letter down. The kitchen was very quiet. "How long?" he said. 4 years, she said. "I got out 8 weeks ago. It took me the first 4 weeks to get from Connecticut to Chicago because I had no money and no identification. My father had arranged for all of that to be. She seemed to be choosing her words with some care. Controlled. Managed. It took me another 2 weeks to get from Chicago to Cheyenne, and then her jaw tightened. Then I had some trouble in Cheyenne, like someone my father had watching the rail lines. I had to go a different way. Hence, the dress, Silas said. It was the only thing I had that wasn't someone else's. It was from before. I kept it. She looked at the table. I'm aware of how that sounds. He didn't say how it sounded. He sat with the letter in his hands and tried to find the shape of what he was feeling, which was harder than it should have been because there were several things happening at once. There was the old grief, which had been sitting in the back of his chest for 4 years and which had hardened into something he'd stopped recognizing as grief and started treating as just the way he was. There was the fury, still there, still real, but different now, redirected, looking for a new target. There was the complicated thing that happened when a story you told yourself for years turned out to have been missing most of its important parts. And underneath all of that, quiet and unwelcome, something else. Something that had been in storage. I need to think, he said. I know. I'm not saying I don't believe you. I'm saying I need time. She nodded. She seemed to have expected this, or something like it. She looked at Caleb, who was looking at her with that steady, open attention that small children bring to things that matter. Can I spend time with him while you do that? I'm not asking to move in or make any kind of... I just want to know him. He doesn't know me at all. Silas looked at his son. Caleb looked back at him. She can stay for supper, Caleb said, with the confident simplicity of a 5-year-old who has decided the matter. She stayed for supper. It was not a graceful meal. Dutch Greer came in midway through and stopped dead in the kitchen doorway and stared at Evelyn with an expression that traveled through several distinct emotional territories before landing somewhere between confused and cautious. He had been with Silas's ranch long enough to know the history, or most of it. Molly had clearly told him the rest. He said Mrs. Boone in a careful voice, and she said Mr. Greer. And then they both looked at their plates and let the food do the conversational work. Caleb talked enough for everyone. He told his mother about the horse he was learning to ride. Bay mare named Copper, stubborn about fences. He told her about the creek at the back of the property where the ice came in early and you could sometimes find interesting rocks. He told her, very seriously, that Dutch's knee made a sound like a hinge when the weather changed and that Dutch said this was useful information. Evelyn listened to all of it with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes on her son's face, and a quality of attention that Silas hadn't seen in a person in a long time. Not polite attention, not performed attention, but the real kind. The kind that comes from someone who has been starving for something and is finally, carefully, eating. When Caleb went to bed, she said goodnight to him at the foot of the stairs, and he hugged her around the middle with both arms, no ceremony, and then ran up without looking back. She stood there for a moment with her hand on the newel post. I should go, she said. I'll have Dutch take you back. It was dark. The road was not complicated, but it wasn't nothing either. He can take the wagon. She didn't argue. At the door, she turned back. The envelope, she said. I don't want it back. It's yours. There are other letters, other things. When you're ready, I'd like you to see them, but I'm not going to rush you. He held the door. Evelyn, he said. It was the first time he'd said her name directly to her face. She stopped. Why was it sealed? The letter. If you wrote it 4 years ago and kept it, why was it still sealed? She looked at him for a long moment. Because I didn't write it for you to have then, she said. I wrote it because I needed it to exist, and it needed to stay sealed until I could hand it to you myself. Otherwise it was just... She stopped. Otherwise, it was just me talking to myself in a locked room. She went out. He closed the door. He stood in his kitchen for several minutes after he heard the wagon roll away. The letter on the table beside the remains of supper, Caleb asleep upstairs, the whole ranch quiet around him, in the particular way it was quiet when the wind died and the animals settled, and there was nothing between a man and the size of the night. He picked up the letter, read it a third time, put it in his coat pocket, and went to bed, knowing that everything that was coming, the confrontation, the evidence, whatever Evelyn's father would do when he found out she had run, was still out there in the dark, and that ready or not, it would arrive. The next morning, Silas rode into town. He didn't tell himself why. He went to the feed store, conducted the business he'd meant to handle 3 days ago, exchanged a few words with the store owner about the weather. He didn't go past the Harlow Inn. He told himself he wasn't going past the Harlow Inn. He went past the Harlow Inn. She was out front, and this surprised him. She was talking to a woman he recognized, Clara Holt, who ran the seamstress shop 2 doors down, and she was not dressed as a disaster or a woman recently escaped from 4 years of captivity. She was dressed plainly, practically, in clothes that were clearly borrowed or purchased secondhand, and she was looking at something Clara was showing her in a catalog, and she was nodding, and then she laughed. A real laugh. A short one. Surprised out of her at something Clara said. Silas had forgotten what her laugh looked like. He kept writing. Bob. That afternoon, Caleb asked him, very directly, in the way that 5-year-olds bypass diplomacy. "Papa, is my mama going to stay?" Silas was mending a section of fence line on the south pasture. He set down the pliers, looked at his son, who was sitting on the fence rail, watching him with those light brown eyes. "I don't know yet," he said. "But you're going to find out?" "I'm working on it." "Working on what part?" Silas picked up the pliers again. "The part where I figure out if I can trust her." Caleb considered this with the jury-weighing look. "I trust her," he said. "You just met her." "I know." The boy swung his feet. "But I think she's sad and she's trying, and Dutch says that's more than most people manage." Silas stared at his son. "Dutch said that?" "He says lots of things when you're not around." Apparently, the fence wire needed 2 more twists. He made them. The wind came across the south pasture and moved through the dry grass, and somewhere on the far side of the property line a hawk was doing something in the upper air, slow and patient and watching. He was not, Silas thought, a man who made decisions in a hurry. He had always been deliberate, sometimes too deliberate. His mother had told him that, and she had been right. But there was a difference between deliberate and stalled, and he needed to know which one he was. The letter was in his coat pocket. It had been in his coat pocket for 2 days. He'd checked 3 times to make sure it was still there. "Papa," Caleb said. "What?" "Are you sad too?" Silas didn't answer right away. He coiled the remaining wire, set it against the post, stood up straight and looked out at the south pasture, at the dry brown grass and the gray sky and the long flat horizon that went on until it reached something that wasn't Wyoming. "Yeah," he said. "A little." Caleb slid off the fence rail and stood beside him, and without ceremony or significance, put his small hand in his father's larger one. They stood there for a minute, looking at the prairie. Neither of them said anything else. That was enough for the moment. That was enough. The town of Harlow Creek had a way of making up its mind about people quickly and then holding those opinions the way old wood holds nails, not always right, but deeply set. By the end of Evelyn's first week, most of it had made up its mind about her, and the verdict was not simple. The women who sewed and traded goods along the main street and gathered on Tuesday mornings at the Lindstrom house for what they called a quilting circle, and what was actually a fairly sophisticated information exchange, had landed in 2 distinct camps. There were those who felt that a woman who vanished from her husband's house and returned 4 years later in a ruined wedding dress was a woman with too much history attached to her for decent company. And there were those, fewer, but louder, who had seen her eyes on the platform, or heard something from Molly Greer, or simply had the instinct that a woman arriving in that condition had not arrived by choice. Clara Holt, the seamstress, was in the second camp and made no secret of it. She had given Evelyn work 3 days after their conversation in front of the shop. Simple alterations, repair work, nothing that required a skilled hand but enough to generate a small income and give her somewhere to be during the days. Evelyn had taken it without hesitation and without the particular flavor of gratitude that tips over into something uncomfortable. She said thank you, sat down at the spare table, and started working. That, more than anything, was what shifted Clara's opinion from cautious sympathy to something more solid. "She doesn't ask for anything she doesn't earn," Clara told Molly Greer on Wednesday, when Molly came in with a skirt that needed its hem let out. "Most women in her situation, I'd expect complaints. Self-pity. Something. She just works." "She's got a lot to prove," Molly said. "Don't we all?" said Clara, and left it there. Silas heard about this secondhand through Dutch, who heard it from Molly. who had apparently decided that keeping Silas informed about the town's opinion of Evelyn was now part of her domestic responsibilities. He didn't ask her to stop. The information was useful, even if he wasn't sure yet what he was using it for. He did not go to see Evelyn that second week. He let Caleb visit her at the seamstress shop twice, with Dutch driving the cart, and both times Caleb came home chattier than usual and full of observations about what his mother had said and done, which Silas listened to without comment but without interrupting. "She knows how to fix things," Caleb reported, climbing down from the cart on Wednesday afternoon with the authority of someone delivering important news. "She fixed Mrs. Holt's sewing machine when the wheel thing got stuck. She looked at it and fixed it." "Good," Silas said. "She said she learned in Caleb scrunched his face. "In Connecticut." "Connecticut. Yeah, she said they had her do a lot of things there." A pause, the small boy's face going slightly puzzled. "She didn't sound happy about it when she said it." Silas crouched down to Caleb's level. "When she talks about that place," he said carefully, "does she seem scared or sad?" Caleb thought about it seriously. "Both," he said. "But she stops looking like that when she's talking to me, like I make it go away a little." Silas looked at his son for a moment. "Okay," he said. "Go wash up before supper." He stood there in the yard after the boy ran inside, the afternoon light going copper and flat across the prairie, and did not think about anything specific for a minute or two. Then he went in and made supper. The trouble started on a Friday. It came in the shape of a man named Gerald Prentice, who arrived on the morning train from Cheyenne and checked into the Harlow Inn under his own name, which told Silas something when he heard it later. Either Prentice was not particularly worried about being identified, or he wanted to be seen. He was a lawyer, or presented himself as one. He wore the clothes of a city man and carried a leather case and asked around town with the polished casualness of someone who had practiced seeming casual whether anyone knew of a woman named Evelyn Harper who might be in the area. He found out what he needed to know within 2 hours. Small towns are not built for secrets. Evelyn came to the ranch that evening without sending word first. She rode the livery horse at a pace that the horse clearly found unreasonable. And when she came through the gate, she was not the composed, deliberate woman who had sat across Silas's kitchen table a week ago. She was not quite panicked. She seemed, in fact, to be actively holding panic back with both hands. But she was moving fast, and her jaw was set in a way that meant something was wrong. Silas was at the barn when she arrived. He came out, and she pulled the horse up short and looked at him from the saddle. "There's a man in town," she said. "Gerald Prentice. He's one of my father's lawyers." "I heard." "You heard?" She blinked. "How?" "Dutch was in town this afternoon. He came back and told me." He looked at her steadily. "Get down from the horse. You're going to unseat yourself riding like that." She got down. Not gracefully. She caught her coat on the saddle horn and had to pull it free, but she got down. She was breathing a little harder than the ride warranted. "What does he want?" Silas asked. "What they always want," she said. "To take me back." "You're not property, Evelyn. Tell my father that." Her voice came out sharper than she'd probably intended. She stopped, looked at the ground. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to. I came here because I didn't know where else to go, and I know I have no right to ask you for anything. But if Prentice is here, it means my father already knows where I am. It means he's been watching the rail lines the whole time. He has people everywhere, and he doesn't give up, and I don't—" She stopped again. Her hands, he noticed, were not entirely steady. "Caleb's inside with Dutch," Silas said. "Come into the kitchen." She looked up. He wasn't smiling. This wasn't warmth exactly. It was something more basic than warmth. The acknowledgement that a person in trouble in his yard was still a person in trouble, and that the kitchen was heated and the yard was not. She followed him in. He put coffee on. She sat at the kitchen table and pressed her palms flat against the surface, the way people do when they're trying to get steady. Dutch appeared in the doorway, read the room, said he'd take Caleb to check on the horses, and disappeared. Silas appreciated that about Dutch. "Tell me about Prentice," he said. "He's a lawyer. My father's been using him for years. He's not stupid, which is the problem. And he's not a good person, which is also the problem." She looked at her hands. "He was there when they took me. Not at the house. He He didn't come to your house. But afterward, when I was at my father's estate in Boston, before they moved me to Connecticut, he was there. He handled the paperwork. What paperwork? The paperwork that said I was... She said the next words with a precise flatness that was harder to hear than anger would have been. That said I was mentally disordered and required supervised care. That gave my father legal guardianship of me as an adult. That made me nobody, on paper. No legal rights, no ability to enter into contracts, no identity that the law would recognize. She looked up. He was very good at it. The paperwork was very thorough. Silas sat down across from her. He set his coffee cup down. How'd you get out? She was quiet for a moment. There was a new nurse, she said finally. She came in January. She was young, younger than me, and she'd been told something different from the truth about the place and what I was there for. She wasn't a bad person who convinced herself it was fine. She was genuinely deceived. When she understood what was actually happening, she helped me. Where is she now? I don't know. I didn't ask her to come with me. I didn't want her to risk more than she already had. Her jaw tightened. I got out through the cellar. There was a door they used for deliveries. She left it unlocked on a Tuesday night when the overnight staff was short. He looked at her for a long moment. Outside, the wind had picked up, and somewhere on the roof, a loose shingle was making a ticking sound it hadn't made that morning. How much does he know, Prentice? Silas asked. About you being here. About Caleb. He knows I'm here. He knows. She stopped. He may know about Caleb. My father knew I had a child. He's known since before he had me taken. He chose to... She stopped again, and this time the stop was harder, the kind that happens when the next words would be the worst ones. He told you I was mentally ill, and he told me my child had died. Those were two different lies he told two different people to make sure neither of us looked for the other. The kitchen was very quiet. Silas picked up his coffee cup and set it back down without drinking from it. He told you Caleb was dead, he said. When I was in Connecticut... Her voice was entirely flat now. In the first year, he came himself to tell me. He sat across from me in that room and told me that the child had died of a fever and that it was a mercy, considering my condition, that I wasn't there to see it. She looked at the table. I believed him for 2 years. I had no way to verify anything. I had no contact with the outside. I believed him for 2 years, and then the new nurse came, and she had been in Wyoming once, and she mentioned a town called Harlow Creek, and I asked about the Boone Ranch, and she knew the name. Ibdiashimin. Silas was a man who kept things inside himself. He had been doing it for long enough that it was no longer effort. It was just the shape of how he moved through the world. But something happened in his chest when she finished that sentence. Something that pressed outward against the inside of his ribs in a way that was not entirely comfortable. He said nothing for a moment. Then, "You need to stay here tonight." She looked up sharply. "I'm not..." He stopped himself, recalibrated. Prentice is in town asking questions. If you're at the inn, you're alone and he can get to you. Here, you're not alone. He held up a hand before she could speak. It's not an offer of anything beyond tonight's safety. You can sleep in the room off the kitchen. It's where Dutch's wife stays when she comes to help. That's all it is. She looked at him for a long moment. He couldn't read everything in her face, but he could read the part where she was deciding whether this was kindness or something else, something with conditions. "All right," she said. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," he said. "That's twice you've thanked me when I told you not to." Something moved across her face. It might have been the beginning of a smile, or the memory of one. "Old habit," she said. Dutch found out about the sleeping arrangement without being told. The man had a gift for absorbing information through walls, and said nothing about it, which was the correct response. Caleb was told his mother was staying over because it was cold and dark, which was true enough and satisfied him completely. He insisted on showing her his bedroom before supper, which involved a thorough accounting of every object in it, including a collection of small rocks from the creek that he'd organized by color with the seriousness of a curator. Evelyn stood in the doorway of her son's room and looked at every single rock he showed her. "This one's my best one," Caleb said, holding up a piece of pale quartz. "Dutch says it might have gold in it." "It might," Evelyn said. "The flecks could be pyrite, which isn't gold, but it's pretty." Caleb looked at her with new respect. "How do you know about rocks?" I read a lot, she said. When I didn't have much else to do, I read. What else did you read about? She sat down on the edge of his bed. She'd been given permission. He'd patted the blanket and thought about it. History. Engineering. I read about how bridges are built once for a whole month, and I read about farming and about horses, and she stopped. Actually, I read about ranching, about how to run a cattle operation. Caleb's eyes went wide. Did you read about fences? Some. Papa hates fences, Caleb said confidentially. He says they're the most necessary evil in Wyoming. From the doorway where Silas had appeared without announcing himself, came the sound of a man who was not going to acknowledge that he'd been accurately quoted by a 5-year-old. Supper, he said. Yeah. Prentice made his move the next morning. He arrived at the ranch gate at 9 o'clock, riding a rented horse, accompanied by a second man who had no particular function except to be large and present. He had the practiced bearing of someone who expected deference and received it often enough to be thrown off when it didn't arrive. Silas met him at the gate. He had seen the rider coming from the yard, and he had walked out without hurrying. Mr. Boone, Prentice said, as though they'd met before. Gerald Prentice. I represent the legal interests of Aldous Harper. I know who you are, Silas said. Prentice adjusted his posture slightly. I'm looking for a woman named Evelyn Harper, formerly Boone, who is a legal ward of Mr. Aldous Harper of Boston, Massachusetts. I have reason to believe she may be on your property. She's my ex-wife, Silas said, and the mother of my son. Under the guardianship arrangement established in... I'm familiar with the arrangement, Silas said. He was not loud about it. He had always found that the quieter he spoke, the more clearly people listened. I'm also familiar with how it was established. You might want to think carefully about how you proceed here. Prentice's expression was smooth, professionally so. Mr. Boone, I have legal documentation. You have documentation drawn up by a man who told his daughter her child was dead, so she'd stop fighting him. Silas said it the same way he'd say the price of feed. Level. No particular heat. That's not something that helps your position in a Wyoming courtroom, Mr. Prentice. I'd give that some thought. Something moved behind Prentice's professional expression. A small recalculation. The documentation is valid under Massachusetts law. This isn't Massachusetts. A silence. Prentice looked at the ranch, at the gate, at Silas's face, at the second man, who was not helping. He seemed to be doing arithmetic about something. I'd like to speak with her, he said. I'll ask her if she wants to speak with you, Silas said. If the answer is yes, I'll let you know. Mr. Boone, that's the offer, Silas said. You're welcome to wait in town. Harlow Creek's got a good inn. He paused. You'd know that already, since you're staying there. Prentice looked at him for a long moment. Then he turned his horse and rode back down the road without another word. The large man followed. Silas watched them go. Then he turned and walked back to the house, and Evelyn was standing on the porch, having apparently watched the entire exchange from there. What did you say to him? She said. Not much. He came up the steps. He'll go back to town and wire your father, and then we'll see what your father decides to do next. That gives us some time. Time for what? Time to figure out what we're doing. She was looking at him in a way that was slightly difficult to interpret. Not gratitude, exactly. Something more complicated than that. The look of someone revising a previous assessment and not entirely sure what to replace it with. You didn't have to do that, she said. You're the mother of my son, he said. Whatever else is true, you're that. He went past her into the house. The next 2 weeks settled into something that was not comfortable exactly, but was functional in the way that people learn to be functional when they've agreed on a temporary arrangement and are waiting to see if it becomes permanent. Evelyn did not move into the ranch house. She went back to the inn, back to her work at Clara Holt's shop, back to the routine she was building from scratch, with the focused energy of someone who understands that routines are not small things. They are evidence of a life that is proceeding, that has direction and structure, that is not just waiting to be interrupted. But she came to the ranch every other day, and Silas let her come, and Caleb treated this as simply the way things were, as children do when adults arrange their lives into patterns. She was useful. That was the thing that he noticed, and it was not the kind of useful that was being performed or demonstrated. She fixed the kitchen window latch that had been sticking since August without being asked and without making a point of having done it. She noticed that one of the younger horses was favoring its right front leg and said something about it at dinner one evening, and turned out to be right about why. When the temperatures dropped and the first real frost came, she was out in the yard helping Caleb cover the winter garden plot with Dutch's wife before Silas had noticed the weather changing. "She's not what I expected," Dutch said one evening, in the barn after supper, which was where Dutch made most of his assessments. "What did you expect?" Silas asked. "Someone who needed more taking care of." Dutch was checking one of the saddle stitchings, not looking at Silas, which was how he handled conversations that had some weight to them. Woman who spent 4 years locked up, you'd figure she'd be, I don't know, softer than she needs to be. Scared of things. She's not. She's scared of some things. Sure, but she doesn't let it stop her working. Dutch finished with the saddle. That's a frontier woman, Silas, whatever else she is. I'm just saying. Silas was quiet. I know what you're doing, Dutch said. You're waiting to see if she's real. Wouldn't you? Probably. Dutch shrugged. I'm just saying you might not have to wait as long as you think. The moment that shifted something, not everything but something, was not dramatic. It was a Wednesday evening, late, when Caleb had a nightmare. He had them occasionally, not often. They were the kind that left him confused and upset without specific content, just a residue of wrong that he couldn't name. Silas was used to hearing him in the night, used to going in and sitting on the edge of the bed until the boy calmed down. That night, Evelyn was there. She had stayed late to help with a repair on the back fence, genuinely needed, not invented, and had been invited to supper because turning out a woman after dark on a cold night was not something Silas was willing to do, regardless of what else was unresolved between them. She had been in the kitchen cleaning up when Caleb cried out, and she had moved before Silas got out of his chair. He found her in the doorway of Caleb's room, not going in, standing in the doorway, waiting. He doesn't know me well enough yet, she said quietly to Silas. You should go. He went in. He sat with Caleb until the boy settled, which took about 10 minutes. Caleb half asleep and holding Silas's hand. When he came back out, Evelyn was still in the doorway. She had not moved. You could have gone in, he said. I know. She looked at the floor. But if he'd woken up all the way and seen me before he was ready, it might have made it worse. He needs to know I'm a safe thing. She looked up. Not just a surprising thing. Those aren't the same. Silas looked at her for a moment. You thought about that while you were standing in the doorway. I've been thinking about it for 4 years, she said. How to come back to him without scaring him. How to be someone he can trust instead of someone he has to get used to. She stopped. I know I'm doing it late. I know I miss things I can't get back, but I'm trying to do the part I'm here for right. He was quiet for a moment. Go sleep, he said. It's late. She went to the kitchen room. He stood in the hallway outside his son's door for a while longer, listening to the quiet. He was not, he realized, as angry as he'd been a week ago. The anger hadn't disappeared. It had just spread out, redistributed itself, moved away from her and toward the people who had built the situation she was now trying to live inside of. That was not the same as trusting her. He knew the difference, but it was something. The letter from Boston arrived on a Thursday, addressed to Silas personally, written on paper so heavy and formal it felt like a statement of intent before you'd even opened it. It was from Aldous Harper. The letter was long and elaborate and said, essentially, 3 things. That Evelyn was a legally documented ward under Massachusetts guardianship law, that her presence in Wyoming was a violation of her care arrangement and exposed anyone harboring her to potential legal liability, and that Aldous Harper was prepared to pursue every available legal remedy to ensure his daughter's return to appropriate care. It was very well written. It was the kind of letter that was designed to make the person reading it feel small and overmatched. Silas read it twice. Then he folded it carefully, put it in the same drawer as the letter Evelyn had written 4 years ago, and went to find his ranch hand. Dutch, he said, I need you to ride to Cheyenne. Dutch looked at him. 4? I need a lawyer, Silas said. A good one, not a cheap one. Dutch nodded once and asked no further questions, which was one of his best qualities. Silas went back to the house, stood at the kitchen window for a moment looking out at the south pasture, at the frost still on the grass in the shadows where the morning sun hadn't reached. He had money set aside. Drought years and good years and careful years had put something aside. Not extravagant, not limitless, but real. He was going to need it. And there was something else underneath the decision that he let himself acknowledge for just a moment before putting it away again, where he kept things that weren't ready yet. He did not want Prentice to win. He did not want Aldous Harper to win. Not because of what it would mean for his own life, but because of what it would mean for Caleb, and because of what it had already cost a woman who had spent 4 years in a locked room reading about bridges and ranching, holding on to a letter she couldn't send, waiting for a Tuesday night when a door got left unlocked. That wasn't the kind of thing you turned your back on. He wasn't sure yet what it meant for everything between him and Evelyn. The broken years, the grief, the trust that was going to have to be rebuilt one careful piece at a time, if it could be rebuilt at all. That was still open. He was honest enough with himself to know it was still open. But Prentice was not taking her back to Connecticut. On that point, Silas Boone was entirely decided. Dutch came back from Cheyenne on a Friday afternoon with a man named Edmund Rourke sitting beside him in the wagon, which was not what Silas had asked for, but turned out to be exactly what was needed. Rourke was not what Silas expected from a Cheyenne lawyer. He was shorter than average, somewhere in his mid-50s, with a neat gray mustache and the kind of watchful stillness that said he spent most of his working hours listening rather than talking. He was dressed well but not showily, and he carried a single leather case that looked like it had been to court more times than most people had been to church. Dutch had found him through a contact at the Territorial Land Office, which suggested he was the kind of lawyer who knew his way around a fight with money on the other side. He shook Silas's hand on the porch, looked at the ranch with a quick professional sweep that was not quite an assessment and not quite admiration, and said, "Your man here tells me you have a guardianship problem from Massachusetts that's crossed state lines." "That's one way to put it," Silas said. "Is there a better way?" "Probably several. Come in." They sat at the kitchen table, the same table that had hosted every significant conversation of the past 3 weeks. And Silas laid out what he had. The letter from Aldous Harper, Evelyn's letter, the 4-year-old one with the faded folds, a summary of what Evelyn had told him about the Connecticut estate, the physician, the paperwork. Rourke read all of it without speaking, without any change in expression, with the focused attention of a man who makes his living turning other people's disasters into workable arguments. When he finished, he set the papers down and looked at Silas. "Where is she?" he asked. "In town. She works at the seamstress shop. She's been there 3 weeks. I need to speak with her. I'll bring her tomorrow." Rourke nodded. "The Massachusetts guardianship order is real," he said, in the tone of someone presenting a problem before presenting the solution. "Legally executed, properly filed. That's the first thing you should understand. This is not a paperwork error. This was done deliberately and done well." He paused. "The second thing you should understand is that it's not invulnerable. A guardian who lies to his ward about the death of her child, who arranges for her to be held in a private facility under false medical pretenses, who uses legal instruments as weapons of control rather than protection, that's not guardianship. That's something else. And there are judges, even in Wyoming, even dealing with Massachusetts law, who will see it that way if the evidence is presented correctly. Do we have enough evidence? Possibly. Depends on what the woman knows and what she can prove." Rourke picked up the 4-year-old letter again, turned it over in his hands. "This is useful. Not definitive, but useful. It establishes intent to communicate, establishes she was not acting freely. Who else was at that Connecticut facility? She mentioned a nurse, young woman. She doesn't know where she is now. She helped her escape? Left a door unlocked." Rourke set the letter down. "That nurse has a name? I can ask." "Ask." They talked for another hour. When Rourke left to settle into the inn for the night, Silas sat at the table for a while after, the familiar cold coffee beside him, the familiar ceiling above. He had spent money he had set aside for a second breeding bull and part of the south pasture fence replacement. He did not regret it. He did regret that it had come to this, that doing the right thing required money. The justice in this territory, as in any other, came with a price list that not everyone could meet. He was one of the ones who could, barely, and he knew it, and he tried to be honest with himself about what that meant. Church. He brought Evelyn to the ranch the next morning. She sat across from Rourke the way she sat across from most things, straight-backed, composed at the surface, with the eyes that never quite stopped moving. She had brought the envelope she always carried, the one that had been her anchor across 4 years and a continent, and she set it on the table without being asked. Rourke looked at it. "Your letters?" "Mine and others," she said. "There are 6 letters in here. The one I wrote to Silas, he has that one. The others are letters I wrote to myself mostly. Dates, names, what happened. I wrote them on whatever paper I could get, and I kept them in the lining of my coat." She paused. "The coat I arrived in. The one before the wedding dress." "Why the coat lining?" "Because they searched my room," she said, "regularly. But the coat was in the entry hall with the others, and they never thought to—" She stopped. My father underestimated how organized I could be when I was angry enough. Something shifted in Rourke's expression. Not quite a smile, but the precursor to one. "Tell me about the physician," he said. Her name was Dr. Harriet Voss. She was, or had been, a practitioner of what was called in that era nervous disorders, a field so loosely defined that it served, in practice, as a repository for women who inconvenienced their families. Rourke wrote the name down carefully. "Do you know if she's still in practice?" he asked. "I don't know anything about her current situation. She was in her 60s when I was there. She may not be practicing. She may not be—" Evelyn stopped. "I don't know. That's fine. Do you know the name of anyone else at the facility? Staff? Other residents? Anyone who might have observed your treatment there?" She gave him 4 names. 3 were staff. One was another woman, a resident, as they were called, who had been at the Connecticut estate for 7 years when Evelyn arrived, and who had quietly told Evelyn, in the first month, that the facility's records were kept in a locked cabinet in the physician's office, and that the physician kept the key on a chain at her belt. "How do you know that?" Rourke asked. "Because she told me. She'd been watching for 7 years. And why hadn't she used that information herself?" Evelyn looked at him with a flatness that was not unkind but was very direct. "Because she had nowhere to go," she said. "She had no family outside that place who hadn't signed her over to it. I had a son." Rourke wrote for a moment without looking up. "The nurse," he said, "the one who helped you leave. Her first name was Anna. I don't know her surname. She had red hair. She was from Ohio. She mentioned it once. She'd been at the facility 4 months when I left. That's not much to find someone." "I know." Evelyn looked at her hands. "I think about her. Whether she got in trouble. Whether—" She stopped. I didn't want to put her at more risk by asking her name. Silas, who had been sitting at the far end of the table through all of this and saying nothing, spoke for the first time. "If your father had people watching the rail lines, he had people watching that facility. When you got out, he'd have known quickly." "Yes." "So if Anna got in trouble, she got in trouble within days of you leaving." "I know." Her voice was entirely even, which meant Silas had started to understand that this was something she had been living with rather than something she was telling for the first time. "There's nothing I could have done differently. I know that. It doesn't make it easier to know." Rourke looked between them. He said nothing about what he was observing. "The immediate question," he said, "is Prentice. He's still in town. He's been here a week, which means he's either waiting for instructions from Harper or he's waiting for a legal opportunity. I suspect the former, Harper will want to move carefully now that there's a complication." "What complication?" Silas asked. "You," Rourke said, "a former spouse who is openly opposing the guardianship, who has resources to engage counsel, and who is in possession of documented correspondence suggesting the ward was not acting voluntarily. That's a complication Aldous Harper did not anticipate." He folded his hands on the table. He anticipated a woman arriving in a frontier town with no money and no support and being easy to retrieve. He did not anticipate this. He gestured briefly at the kitchen, at Silas, at the general arrangement of things. Something in Evelyn's face moved quietly, not dramatically. She looked at the table. She did not say anything. Silas did not look at her, but he noticed. The thing about small towns and secrets is that they don't coexist particularly well, and what Evelyn was gradually discovering was that Harlow Creek had, without any formal process or announcement, begun to take sides. It had started with Clara Holt, who had told 2 women about Prentice's arrival and what it likely meant, and those 2 women had told others, and within a week the general shape of Evelyn's situation was known to most of the town in the way that things are known in small places, Not precisely, not with all the details right, but known in essence in the emotional truth of it, which was, a woman who had been taken from her child was being pursued by the man who had taken her, and the man's lawyer was sitting in the Harlow Inn ordering meals and waiting. People did not like that last part. The town of Harlow Creek was not a particularly sentimental place. It had been built out of hard years and harder ground, and the accumulated persistence of people who had stayed when leaving would have been easier. It did not have a lot of patience for the particular kind of power that operated from a distance through paperwork and hired men. The feed store owner, a stubborn Norwegian named Lars Veld, had been deliberately unforthcoming when Prentice asked him questions about the Boone Ranch. The women at the Tuesday Circle had decided, by some collective process that required no formal vote, that Evelyn was welcome at Clara Holt's shop and at the Lindstrom house, and that anyone who made her feel unwelcome in those places would be answering to them. The deputy sheriff, a young man named Cole Ferris, who was newer to his job than he'd have liked and tried to compensate with extra conscientiousness, had gone to Silas privately and said that he didn't know exactly what was legal in this situation, but that Prentice had no authority to remove anyone from Wyoming by force, and that if he tried, there would be consequences that didn't require a Massachusetts court to sort out. Silas thanked him. Cole went red and said he was just doing his job and left quickly, which was how he handled most things. Evelyn didn't know about most of this until Molly Greer told her, bluntly and without sentiment, over coffee at the Lindstrom house on a Tuesday morning. "The town's decided it likes you," Molly said. "Don't make a fuss about it. Just accept it and move on." Evelyn looked at the coffee in her cup. "I haven't done anything to earn that." "You showed up," Molly said, "in a wrecked dress with nothing. You didn't cry about it or make it anyone else's problem. You found work and you did it and you came back for your boy. That's enough for most people around here." That's just surviving." "On the frontier," Molly said, with the authority of a woman who had survived several things herself, surviving well is how you earn people. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I didn't know people like this existed." "What kind of people?" "People who decide to be on your side before they know everything." Molly refilled her coffee cup without ceremony. "Well," she said, "now you know." The crisis arrived on a Wednesday, without warning, in the shape of 3 men on horseback coming through the Boone Ranch gate at 7 in the morning. Silas was in the barn. Dutch was with him. Caleb was in the house still eating breakfast, where Evelyn had arrived an hour earlier to help with the morning, which had become a quiet habit neither of them had formally agreed to. The 3 men were not Prentice. They were different, harder looking, with the bearing of men who were paid to resolve things physically rather than legally. One of them carried a paper, which he presented to Dutch in the yard as though Dutch were the decision-making party, demanding to know if a woman named Evelyn Harper was on the premises. Dutch looked at the paper. He could not read particularly well, and he knew it. He looked at the paper long enough to seem like he was reading it carefully, and then he said, "I'll have to get Mr. Boone." He got Silas. Silas came out of the barn and looked at the 3 men and at the paper, which Rourke had warned him might be coming, a writ of some kind, engineered through whatever legal connections Aldous Harper had in the Wyoming territorial system. It was not nothing. It was not necessarily as powerful as it looked either. "Who sent you?" Silas asked. "That's not information I'm required to provide," the man with the paper said. "You're on my land. Everything that happens here is information I'm entitled to." Silas's voice was level. "Who sent you?" The man looked at him, made a calculation. "Mr. Harper's representative in this territory." "Prentice." No answer, which was an answer. "That paper," Silas said, "has no authority to remove anyone from this property without consent. If you attempt to do so, you will be committing an act that the territorial deputy sheriff will have a clear opinion about, and he is 12 minutes ride away and expecting to hear from me this morning." This was not entirely true. Cole Ferris was not expecting to hear from him specifically, but it was close enough. "I suggest you go back to Prentice and tell him to pursue this through the courts, which is where my lawyer will be happy to meet him." The man with the paper looked at his 2 companions. Then he looked at Silas. Then he looked at Dutch, who was standing to Silas's left with the particular quality of stillness that large men with bad knees and no patience develop. "We'll be back," the man said. "Use the gate," Silas said. They left. Silas went back into the house. Evelyn was standing just inside the kitchen doorway. She had heard most of it through the window. Her face was the contained, careful face she wore when she was managing something difficult, but her hands were at her sides and they were not relaxed. "They'll come back," she said. "I know. Prentice is going to find a way to make the paper look more valid than it is. He has access to the territorial judges through my father's connections. He'll find one who'll—" "Rourke is already working on that," Silas said. "He left for Cheyenne yesterday. He knows which judges are which." She looked at him. "How does Rourke know that?" "Because he's been practicing law in this territory for 20 years, and he was here before half those judges were appointed." Silas poured himself coffee from the pot on the stove, more because it gave him something to do with his hands than because he wanted it. "Sit down, Evelyn." She sat. Caleb was still at the table, watching both of them with the quiet alertness of a child who knows something important is happening and is deciding whether to ask about it. "Papa," Caleb said, "were those men bad?" "They were men doing what someone else told them to do," Silas said, "which isn't always the same thing as being bad. Sometimes it's just being stupid." Caleb considered this. "Dutch says stupid is worse sometimes." "Dutch isn't wrong." Evelyn made a sound, not quite a laugh, the edge of one, and pressed her hand over her mouth for a moment. Caleb looked at her and grinned, and for just a second the kitchen was something other than a war room. It was Rourke who found the thread that began to unravel everything. He returned from Cheyenne 4 days later with a letter that had been waiting at the territorial post office, forwarded from a law office in Hartford, Connecticut. It had been sent 3 weeks prior, addressed to Edmund Rourke specifically, which meant someone had known to contact him specifically, which meant someone had been paying attention to what was happening in Harlow Creek from a considerable distance. The letter was from a woman named Catherine Marsh, formerly employed as a physician's assistant at a private care facility in Westport, Connecticut. Her description of her employment, her dates of service, her duties, the name of the facility's director, matched precisely what Evelyn had told them. Her description of the facility's practices was detailed, clinical, and damning in a way that went beyond one woman's situation. She described a pattern. Multiple women, over multiple years, held under documentation that had been generated, signed, and filed with the connivance of the attending physician, the facility director, and at least 3 lawyers whose names she provided. She described the system by which families paid the facility, not for medical care, but for the management of inconvenient people. She described how records were falsified, how family members were lied to, how the women themselves were told things that were not true to make them compliant or to make them stop fighting. She described Evelyn by name. She described the date of Evelyn's arrival, the condition she had arrived in, the documentation that had accompanied her. She described Dr. Voss's conduct. She described 2 specific conversations she had witnessed between the facility director and Gerald Prentice. And she provided her contact information and her willingness to testify. Rourke sat across from Silas and Evelyn at the kitchen table and read the relevant sections aloud, his voice steady and professional. And when he finished, there was a silence that had a different quality from the other silences that Kitchen had held. Evelyn's hands were flat on the table. She was looking at the letter without touching it. "Who is she?" Silas asked. "This former employee," Rourke said. "She left the facility approximately 18 months ago. From the letter, it appears she left because of what she witnessed, and she has been trying since then to find a way to bring what she knows to someone who could use it." "Why now?" Silas asked. "Why did she contact you now?" "Because Evelyn left," Evelyn said. Her voice was strange, not broken, but thin in a way that meant something underneath it was under pressure. "When I got out, it was evidence that the facility's control had failed. That's the kind of thing that makes other people decide they've been waiting long enough." She was looking at the letter and not at either of them. "The nurse," Silas said quietly. "Anna." Evelyn nodded once. "She's from Ohio. Her name is not Anna Marsh." She stopped. "But Catherine. She told me her name was Anna when she..." She stopped again. "She used a different name. She was protecting herself." The kitchen was very quiet. "She contacted you," Silas said to Rourke. 3 weeks ago, before I was involved in this case. Someone, I don't know who, gave her my name as someone who might be able to act on what she knew. Can you? Evelyn asked. She looked up from the letter. Her eyes were clear, which was different from calm. It was the particular clarity of someone who has spent a long time in the dark and has just seen a light and is trying to decide if it's real. Can you actually use this? Yes, Rourke said. Not immediately, not without more work. But yes, this letter, combined with your documentation, combined with the correspondence you've provided, is the kind of evidence that doesn't just challenge Aldous Harper's guardianship order. It challenges the legal infrastructure that made it possible. He paused. This isn't just your case anymore, Evelyn. If we proceed correctly, it is several cases. It involves people with more exposure than your father and Prentice may have anticipated when they sent men to your ex-husband's gate. Evelyn was quiet for a long moment. What do I need to do? She asked. First, I need a full written account from you. Dates, names, everything you told me and everything you didn't. I need it in your handwriting, signed, witnessed. Rourke straightened his papers. Second, we need to respond to Harper's position formally and publicly. That means filing in the territorial court here, not in Massachusetts. It means making this a Wyoming matter instead of letting them keep it a Massachusetts matter. He looked at Silas. That requires money and time. I know, Silas said. I want to be clear that there's no guarantee of a quick resolution. Harper has resources. He'll fight. I know that too. Rourke looked between them. Then we proceed. That night, after Rourke left and Dutch took Caleb to check on the horses with the specific purpose of giving the adults some space, Silas and Evelyn were alone in the kitchen for the first time without a specific agenda between them. No lawyer, no plans, no immediate crisis to navigate. Evelyn sat at the table with her hands around a coffee cup gone cold and looked at nothing in particular. She had been composed through the entire meeting, through the reading of Catherine Marsh's letter, through the planning and the questions. The composure was still there, but it was thinner now, the way things get at the end of a long day. Silas sat down across from her. He didn't say anything right away. She remembered me, Evelyn said. Not to him specifically, just said it. Catherine, she kept track. She left that place partly because of what happened to me, and then she spent a year and a half trying to find someone who could help, and she stopped. She did, Silas said. I thought I was alone in it, Evelyn said. Her voice was very quiet. For 4 years. I thought it was just me and that sealed letter and trying to keep enough of myself together to still be a person at the end of it. I didn't know anyone was. She stopped. She didn't cry. He'd noticed over the past weeks that she didn't cry easily, and he suspected this was something the Connecticut years had either taught her or forced into her. The discipline of keeping emotion below the surface, because showing it had consequences she'd learned not to invite. But her face, in that moment, was the most unguarded he'd seen it. You're not alone in it now, he said. It was a plain thing to say, not particularly eloquent. He was not a particularly eloquent man, but he meant it exactly as he said it, no more and no less. She looked at him. He held her gaze. He didn't look away, and he didn't add anything to what he'd said. She nodded once, slowly. Outside, Caleb's voice carried from the barn, asking Dutch something about the horses, and Dutch's low answer followed, and somewhere far out on the prairie, the first coyotes of the evening started. I need to ask you something, Evelyn said. Go ahead. She was quiet for a moment, getting the words in order. Do you believe me? She said. Not the letter, not Rourke's evidence, not Catherine. Do you believe me? Because I need to know. Not for the case, just I need to know. He looked at her for a long moment. Yes, he said. She let out a breath she'd been holding, probably, for 3 weeks. Okay, she said. Okay. Neither of them spoke for a while. The kitchen settled around them, the sounds of the ranch, the wind outside picking up again, the fire in the stove doing what fires do. It was not a comfortable silence, exactly. It was not a resolved one. There was still too much between them that was unfinished, too much that would require time and honesty and the particular hard work of two people who had been broken in related ways trying to figure out if they still fit. But it was a real silence, an honest one, the kind that can only exist after something true has been said. Silas picked up his cold coffee and set it down again. Dutch is going to be insufferable when he finds out about the letter, he said. Evelyn blinked. Then, why? Because he told me 2 weeks ago to trust you, and I told him I was thinking about it, and he said, Silas, you already do. You're just too stubborn to say so. He paused. He'll consider it a personal victory. Evelyn looked at him for a moment, and this time the thing that moved across her face was real. Not the edge of a smile or the memory of one, but an actual one, small and tired and genuine. Well, she said, give him the win. He's earned it. Silas looked at her, and for the first time since she'd stepped off that train in a wrecked wedding dress, something in him that had been locked up for 4 years moved, just slightly, just enough to notice, toward the possibility of something else. He didn't say anything about it, but he noticed. The territorial courthouse in Cheyenne was not an impressive building. It was 3 stories of sandstone that had been laid in a hurry and showed it, uneven mortar lines, window frames that sat slightly crooked, a front door that required a firm shoulder to open properly. But inside, in a room on the second floor with tall windows and hard wooden benches, and the particular smell of papers and old ambition, the law of Wyoming territory was conducted, and that was what mattered. Rourke had filed in the 3rd week of November. The hearing was set for December 8th. In the 3 weeks between, Silas's ranch became something it had never been before, a headquarters of sorts, for the preparation of a legal case that had grown considerably larger than one woman's guardianship dispute. Catherine Marsh, who was indeed the woman Evelyn had known as Anna, who had given a false name for the 4 months she worked at the Connecticut facility before leaving in January, had agreed to travel to Wyoming to provide testimony in person. She arrived on a Tuesday, the same day of the week Evelyn had escaped through the cellar door, which neither of them mentioned but both of them clearly noticed. She was younger than Silas had pictured, mid-20s, with red hair and the careful manner of someone who had been thinking about this conversation for a long time and was trying not to say it wrong. She and Evelyn saw each other in the kitchen, and neither of them spoke for a moment, and then Evelyn said, Catherine. And Catherine said, I'm sorry it took me so long. And that was the beginning and end of the formal acknowledgement of everything. They sat down and got to work, because that was what there was to do, and they were both, at their cores, practical women. Rourke had also located one of the other names Evelyn had provided, a staff member from the Connecticut facility named George Aldred, who had left the position 2 years prior and who, when contacted by letter, had responded with a terseness that Rourke read as fear and Silas read as someone waiting for someone else to go first. After Catherine's agreement to testify, Rourke sent a second letter to Aldred. The second letter produced a longer response, and then a wire, and then the confirmation that George Aldred would provide a written affidavit if not required to appear in person. It was not everything. It was enough to build on. Prentice had not left Harlow Creek. He had been there for nearly 5 weeks, which was longer than anyone had expected, and which meant, Rourke explained, that Harper was managing this personally and carefully and did not intend to let it go. A second letter had arrived from Harper, this one addressed directly to Rourke, written in the language of a man who was accustomed to resolving legal matters through financial persuasion rather than actual adjudication. It offered, in very polished terms, a settlement. Evelyn's guardianship would be formally dissolved, she would receive a small financial sum, and in exchange all parties would agree to pursue no further legal action regarding the Connecticut facility or its practices. Rourke read it to Silas and Evelyn at the kitchen table. He wants it to go away, Silas said. He's scared, Evelyn said. She said it not with satisfaction, but with a flatness that was more complicated than satisfaction. He knows Catherine is here. He knows what she knows. He's trying to make the problem smaller before it becomes a public one. That's exactly right, Rourke said, which means we have leverage we didn't have a month ago. He set the letter down. The question is whether you want to use that leverage to end this quickly or to proceed to the hearing and use it to end something larger. Evelyn looked at the letter, then at Rourke. What does proceeding mean, specifically? For other people. Not for me. Rourke folded his hands. Catherine's testimony, if it enters the court record, becomes a matter of public record. The names she provides, the lawyers, the physician, the facility director, those names become part of a legal proceeding that other people can reference and build upon. Aldred's affidavit adds to that record. Your own documentation adds to it. He paused. There are, in that Connecticut facility, women who are still there. If this record exists, it gives someone a foundation to act. The kitchen was very quiet. Silas watched Evelyn's face. He had become, over the past weeks, good at reading the things it didn't show directly, the things that lived underneath the composure. We proceed, she said. It was not a dramatic declaration. She said it the way she said most things, quietly, with the weight of something decided rather than something felt. It will be harder, Rourke said. I know. Harper will not be generous once we decline. He's never been generous, Evelyn said. He's just strategic about when he's cruel. Rourke nodded and made a note. The week before the hearing, Prentice made his last move in Harlow Creek. It was not a legal one. He approached Silas in the street, which took a certain nerve or a certain miscalculation of what kind of man Silas was. And he spoke with the smooth directness of someone who has decided to dispense with subtlety because subtlety has stopped working. Mr. Boone, he said, I'd like to speak frankly. You've been speaking frankly since you arrived, Silas said. It hasn't gotten you far. Prentice adjusted his coat. You're spending money you don't easily have. You're involved in a legal matter that doesn't directly benefit you. Your ex-wife's situation, whatever she's told you, is, at its core, a family matter between a father and a daughter that has been managed, perhaps imperfectly, but with her welfare in mind. Silas looked at him. Her welfare. She has a history of instability. She was stable enough to document 4 years of captivity in the lining of her coat, Silas said. She was stable enough to spend a year getting from Connecticut to Wyoming without money or identification. She was stable enough to find work inside of a week and hold it. He paused. If that's what instability looks like in your experience, Mr. Prentice, I think you should reconsider your definitions. Prentice's professional expression held, but something behind it recalibrated. What exactly do you want from this, Mr. Boone? You and she are divorced. She has no legal claim on you or your property. You could walk away from this entirely? She's the mother of my son, Silas said. It was the third time he'd said it to this man. He found he didn't mind repeating it. And if the court rules against her, then we'll appeal. Silas looked at him steadily. I want to be clear about something, Mr. Prentice. I don't know what you were told about who you'd be dealing with when you came out here. But I'm not a man who is going to tire of this. I'm not going to run out of will. You can make this expensive and you can make it slow, but you cannot make me stop. He paused. Tell that to Aldous Harper when you wire him tonight. Prentice looked at him for a long moment. Then he turned and walked away. Silas stood on the street for a moment after he'd gone. He was not, he would have told anyone who asked, a man of strong words. He had never thought of himself that way, but something about the past 2 months had settled something in him that he hadn't known was unsettled, a certainty about what was worth fighting for and what wasn't, a clarity about where he stood that didn't require much thought to access. He went to the feed store and bought the things on his list and rode home. Boone. Evelyn did not sleep the night before the hearing. Silas knew because he didn't sleep much either, and at 2 a.m, he heard movement in the kitchen. She had been staying at the ranch for the past week, the room off the kitchen, because Rourke had said he wanted everyone available for last-minute preparation. And he lay in his bed and listened and then got up. She was at the table. No coffee. No lamp. Just sitting in the dark with her hands folded in front of her. And the particular quality of stillness that meant she was not resting but thinking too hard to move. He lit the lamp. She looked up. I'm not going to tell you not to be nervous, he said. Good, she said. Because I am. He put the coffee on, sat down across from her while it heated. Outside, it was deep winter dark and deeply quiet, the kind of quiet that the prairie does at 2 a.m. with the wind stopped. What are you afraid of? He asked, not dismissively, just asking. She was quiet for a moment. That it won't be enough, she said, that my father will find a way, that even with Catherine and George Aldred and all of it, a judge will look at the paperwork from Massachusetts and decide that's what's real and everything else is... She stopped. I've spent 4 years watching people decide that what my father arranged on paper was more real than what was actually happening. It's hard to trust that that's changed. Rourke thinks it's enough. I know. Rourke has been in that courthouse for 20 years. I know that too. She looked at her hands. Knowing things and believing them are different. He got up when the coffee was ready and poured 2 cups and came back and sat down. She wrapped her hands around the cup the way she always did, like warmth was something she was still getting used to having access to. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Yes. When you were there, in Connecticut. What did you think about, specifically, day to day?" She looked up. It was not a question she'd expected. "Caleb," she said, "mostly Caleb. What he looked like. What he'd look like when he was older. What his voice sounded like, because I only heard it a few times, when he was very small, and I was terrified I'd forget it." She paused. "And I thought about the ranch. About Wyoming. I hadn't liked it much at first when I came out with my father. It seemed hard and plain and without much beauty. But in Connecticut, it was what I thought about, the space of it, the way the sky looked." She stopped. "And sometimes I thought about you." He was very still. "Not—" She stopped, started again. "Not with any expectation. I didn't know what you believed about me. I assumed the worst because the worst made sense from where you were standing, but I thought about you because you were part of the life that had been real. Before." She looked at the table. "That's all?" He sat with that for a moment. "I thought you left me," he said. "For 4 years I thought you made a choice and went." "I know. That was the version I lived with." He stopped. It was not easy to say, and he wasn't going to make it sound easy. I had to rebuild everything around that version because it was the one I had." "I know," she said again. "And I'm not asking you to. I'm not asking anything from you, Silas. Not about that. Not about us. Whatever that means now or doesn't mean. I'm not here for that. What are you here for?" She looked up at him directly. "Caleb," she said, "to be his mother. To be present for it instead of just believing he exists somewhere and hoping he's all right." Her voice was steady. "That's what I came back for." He looked at her for a long moment. "And everything else," he said, "everything between you and me. You're just going to leave that?" Something flickered in her face. "I don't know what there is between us anymore, Silas. I know what there was. I know what was destroyed. I know who destroyed it and why, but that doesn't—" She stopped. "You can't just reconstruct something because the reason it broke wasn't your fault. It doesn't work that way." "No," he said. "It doesn't." They sat in the quiet for a while. The lamp made its small circle of light, and outside the night was still holding. "But it might work some other way," he said. She looked at him. He was not a man who said things he didn't mean, and she knew that by now. She looked at his face in the lamplight, and something in her expression did the complicated thing it did when she was deciding how much to let herself want. "Maybe," she said, carefully, like a person walking on ice of unknown thickness. "Maybe," he said, and left it there, because 2 a.m. before the most important day of her life in 4 years was not the time to push further. Some things needed to arrive at their own pace. He refilled her coffee. She didn't tell him not to. The hearing took most of the day. The courthouse room was not large, and it filled quickly. Rourke and his materials at one table, a lawyer from Cheyenne who had been engaged by Harper at the other, the judge behind the bench with the patience of a man who had heard many difficult things and intended to hear these ones with equal care. Silas sat in the first row behind Rourke. Dutch was beside him, which he had not arranged but which he did not object to. Catherine Marsh sat 2 seats down from Dutch. She was in a dark dress with her red hair pulled back, and she sat very straight, and her hands in her lap were clasped and steady. She had traveled from Ohio for this. She had left a position she had only recently found and spent her own savings on the train fare, and she sat in that Wyoming courthouse with the posture of someone who has decided that the cost is the cost, and that's the end of that calculation. Evelyn sat at the table beside Rourke. She had borrowed a good coat from Clara Holt, dark blue wool, well-made, a little large in the shoulders, and she had done her hair properly. She looked like herself, which was to say, she looked like a woman who was not trying to look like anything except exactly what she was. She had the sealed envelope in her coat pocket, the one that had started as 1 letter and become 6. Silas had seen her put it there that morning and had not commented. Aldous Harper had not come himself. His lawyer, a man named Whitmore from Cheyenne, was well-dressed and visibly confident, which Rourke had predicted and said should not be mistaken for well-prepared. The judge's name was Walter Crane. He was in his late 60s with a face like old leather and eyes that moved over documents the way a carpenter's hands move over wood, feeling for what was wrong, not just looking. Rourke opened with the facts in the order that best told the story. The marriage, the disappearance, the abandonment claim, the guardianship papers from Massachusetts, and then the documents that complicated the narrative that had been constructed around Evelyn's name for 4 years. He presented the letter she had written to Silas, the personal documentation she had maintained, Catherine Marsh's written account, George Aldred's affidavit. He presented them without theater, just fact after fact in a voice that was so calm it became itself a kind of argument, the argument that these facts were solid enough not to need performance. Whitmore objected several times, and each time Judge Crane listened to the objection and ruled on it with the precision of someone who was going to get this right the first time so he didn't have to do it again. Catherine testified for 40 minutes. She described what she had witnessed in the specificity that made the room very quiet. Not dramatically quiet, but the quiet of people who are listening hard. She described Evelyn's arrival at the facility, her condition, the documentation that had accompanied her. She described conversations between the facility director and Gerald Prentice. She described what she had been told about the purpose of the facility when she was hired, and what she had learned the purpose actually was. When Whitmore cross-examined her, he tried 3 different angles of attack. That her testimony was motivated by a grudge against her former employer, that she could not have had the access to information she claimed, and that her own credibility was undermined by the fact that she had participated, even briefly, in the facility's operation. Catherine answered the first 2 calmly. On the third, she said, "I worked there for 4 months before I understood what I was part of. When I understood, I left. And then I spent a year and a half trying to find someone with the standing and resources to do something about what I knew. I am here because I could not look at myself in a mirror and tell myself I had done enough." She paused. "I don't know what the law considers sufficient evidence of good conscience, but that is mine." There was no sound in the room for a moment. Judge Crane made a note. Evelyn testified in the afternoon. She was on the stand for over an hour, and she told her story in the same ordered, factual way she had told it in the kitchen. Not reaching for sympathy, not performing pain, just laying out what had happened in the sequence it had happened. The dates, the names, the specific conversations, the specific lies. When Whitmore cross-examined her, he pressed on the medical documentation, the physician's classification of her as mentally disordered, the records that had been generated and signed and filed. Those records were produced, Evelyn said, by a physician who was paid by my father to produce them. The diagnosis was not reached through examination or observation. It was determined before I arrived at the facility because my father had already arranged my admission. Dr. Voss wrote what she was paid to write. "That is a serious allegation," Whitmore said. "Yes," Evelyn said. "It is. That's why I'm making it in a courtroom instead of in a letter." Judge Crane looked at the papers in front of him for a moment. Then he looked at Whitmore. "Does your client have documentation of Dr. Voss's clinical process? Notes, examination records, consultation logs?" Whitmore paused. "Your Honor, the clinical records are yes or no, Mr. Whitmore." A pause. "Not in our current submission, Your Honor." Crane made another note. The afternoon moved forward with the particular grinding momentum of legal proceedings, and by 4 o'clock the testimonies were complete, and Rourke was delivering his closing argument in the voice of a man who knows he doesn't need to be loud because the room is already listening. "The guardianship documentation submitted by Mr. Harper was generated by people who were paid by Mr. Harper for a specific result," he said. "The woman who was subjected to that documentation spent 4 years in a private facility under conditions she has described in sworn testimony, and her account has been corroborated by 2 independent witnesses. The claim that she abandoned her husband and child is contradicted by a letter written in her own hand, dated 11 days after her removal from the family home, which has been in this court's evidence since this morning." He paused. "What this court has before it is not a complex medical case. It is a simple question of whether legal instruments can be used to imprison a person against her will for the convenience of her family. The answer to that question should be simple. Judge Crane did not rule that day. He said he would deliver his decision within 5 days and dismiss the court. Evelyn sat at the table after the room had begun to empty. She did not move immediately. Silas came forward from the first row and sat in the chair Rourke had vacated and did not say anything because there was nothing useful to say at this particular moment, and he knew it. She was looking at her hands. "It went well," she said. It was not a question. "Rourke thinks so." "What do you think?" He had watched Judge Crane's face for most of the day. He had watched the way the man's eyes moved when Whitmore couldn't produce the clinical records, the small recalibration that happened behind a face trained to show nothing. "I think Crane is a man who wants to get it right," Silas said. "And I think getting it right in this case is not actually that complicated, if you're being honest." She looked up at him. "Come on," he said. "Dutch has had Caleb all day and he's going to want rescuing." She almost smiled. "Dutch or Caleb?" "Probably both." Judge Crane delivered his ruling in 4 days, not 5. The guardianship order, he found, had been obtained through fraudulent representation of medical evidence and therefore had no enforceable standing in the Wyoming territory, or as he noted with a dryness that suggested this was not an accidental observation, in any jurisdiction where the courts were operating in good faith. He referred the matter of the Connecticut facility to the relevant authorities in that state. He referred the matter of the fraudulent documentation to the territorial attorney's office. He restored Evelyn Harper Boone's legal identity. He formally recognized her as the mother of Caleb Boone. The courtroom was not full. It was a ruling day, not a hearing day, and these things drew fewer people. But Rourke was there, and Silas, and Dutch, who had come along and sat in the back with his hat in his hands and his bad knee at an awkward angle the whole time without complaining. And Evelyn was there. She sat very still while the ruling was read. When it was finished, she sat still for another moment, and then she pressed both hands over her face, not performing anything, just needing a moment to be inside what had just happened without anyone being able to see her face. Silas sat beside her and waited. When she brought her hands down, her eyes were red at the edges, and her expression was something he didn't have a word for, too complicated for relief, too grounded for joy, too real for either. "It's done," she said. "Most of it," he said. "There'll be more to handle. Prentice, the facility, your father's response." "I know." She looked at him. "I know there's more, but this part is done." He looked at her for a moment, then he nodded. Dutch appeared at the end of the row, hat still in his hands, and said in his most carefully neutral voice, "I brought Caleb. He's in the hall. I didn't know if it was—" He gestured vaguely at the courtroom. "Appropriate." Evelyn was on her feet before he finished the sentence. Caleb was in the hallway, sitting on a bench, his legs swinging, wearing his good coat that was slightly too small because he had grown since last winter, and no one had gotten around to replacing it yet. He looked up when the courtroom door opened. "Mama," he said, with the particular certainty he'd had since the first day on the platform, the certainty of someone who simply knows what they know and doesn't see the point in doubting it. She went to him and he slid off the bench and she pulled him against her, and this time she let herself cry, quietly, into the top of his head, and he held on with both arms and didn't ask why she was crying, because somehow he understood that some things don't need explaining. Silas stood in the courthouse hallway and watched his son and his ex-wife, and felt something that had been locked since September of 1887 give way in his chest. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in the way that ice goes in the first real warmth of spring, which is not dramatic at all, but which changes everything about what the world looks like afterward. Dutch appeared beside him and said nothing, which was the correct response. After a moment, Silas said, "Don't." "Don't what?" Dutch said. "Whatever you're about to say about being right." Dutch put his hat back on. "I wasn't going to say anything." "You were." "Maybe," Dutch said, "but I've got enough sense to let the moment breathe." He walked away toward the building's front door, and Silas let him go, and stood in the hallway while December light came through the courthouse windows, and Caleb said something that made his mother laugh. Not the edge of a laugh this time, not the memory of one, but a real one. And the sound of it moved through the hallway like something that had been waiting a long time to be let loose. The days after Judge Crane's ruling did not feel like victory. Not immediately. Victory, Evelyn was discovering, was a more complicated thing than she had imagined during the 4 years she had spent working toward it. It did not arrive clean and finished and resolved. It arrived tangled up with everything that still needed doing everything that the fight had cost, and the strange disorientation of a person who has been braced for so long against something that the sudden absence of that thing leaves her not relieved but uncertain which way to stand. Prentice left Harlow Creek on the morning train 2 days after the ruling, without ceremony and without speaking to anyone. He was simply gone. The inn room empty, his rented horse returned to the livery, his large companion gone with him. Silas heard about it from Lars Veld at the feed store, who reported the departure with a satisfaction that he made no effort to conceal. Aldous Harper's response came not through lawyers, but through silence, which was in some ways more uncomfortable than a letter. Rourke had notified the relevant authorities in Connecticut, and those notifications had set in motion a process that would take months. Investigations, interviews, the slow machinery of institutions examining their own failures, which never moved quickly and never moved cleanly. But it had started. The facility in Westport was placed under review by the state's medical board within 3 weeks of the hearing. Dr. Voss, who was indeed still practicing, was suspended pending investigation. The director of the facility, whose name appeared in both Catherine's testimony and George Aldred's affidavit, resigned before the first official inquiry arrived. Aldous Harper himself was not arrested. Not then, not quickly. Men with his resources and his connections did not get arrested quickly, but the territorial attorney's office had his name, and Rourke had made sure of that. And there were people in Boston and Hartford who had been waiting for exactly this kind of legal foundation to bring their own complaints forward. Rourke told Evelyn this in December, 2 weeks after the ruling, and he told her with the measured honesty of a man who would not promise what he couldn't deliver, but who believed in what he was saying. "He will face consequences," Rourke said, "not on your timeline, not as completely as you deserve. But the infrastructure that protected him has been cracked, and cracks in things like that tend to spread." Evelyn sat with that for a moment. "That's not justice," she said. "No," Rourke said. "It's the beginning of it, which is usually the most you can get when the other party has money and time." She looked at him. "Is that supposed to be consoling?" "It's supposed to be true," he said. "I find truth more useful than consoling in the long run." She thought about it. "So do I," she said. "I just needed a moment to be disappointed about it." Rourke allowed her the moment. Catherine Marsh stayed in Harlow Creek through Christmas. She had not planned to. She had planned to testify and return to Ohio, where she had a position at a doctor's office doing clerical work and a small room in a boarding house that was hers and private, and which she valued more than it might have appeared to someone who had always had privacy available. But Clara Holt had offered her a spare room, and something about the town had gotten into her the way things get into people sometimes without their permission. She and Evelyn spent time together in the evenings, after Caleb was asleep, and Silas was doing whatever Silas did in the evenings, which was usually something practical. They sat in Clara's front room and talked, sometimes about the facility, more often about other things, what Catherine had done after she left, where she'd gone, what the year and a half of trying to find someone to listen had been like. They talked about it the way people talk about difficult things when they are past the worst of it, and trying to understand what it meant from the outside. One evening, Catherine said, "I thought about not coming." To Harlow Creek? To testify. "I thought about it for a week when Rourke's letter came. I thought about what it would cost and what I'd be going back into, even just in terms of having to say it all again, in a room, in front of people." She was looking at the fire. "And then I thought about you getting on a train in October in a wedding dress with nothing. And I thought, if you could do that, I could do this." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. "I didn't know what else to do," she said. "It wasn't courage. It was just the only direction left." "Most courage is," Catherine said. It was not a profound exchange. It was two tired women sitting by a fire in December talking honestly. But Evelyn held on to it because it was true, and because true things she had learned were worth holding. The question of what came next, between Silas and Evelyn, between the ranch and the future, did not resolve itself the way that legal matters resolve themselves, with a ruling and a signature and a clear before and after. It resolved the way human things resolve, slowly, unevenly, with false starts and backtracked positions, and the occasional conversation that went sideways before it went somewhere useful. What happened first was practical. Evelyn had been living in the room off Clara's kitchen since she arrived in October, working at the seamstress shop, paying her way. After the ruling, there was no longer a legal threat pressing on the arrangement, which meant the arrangement could be reconsidered on its own terms. Clara's room was small and the shop was not lucrative enough to support a second person indefinitely, and Harlow Creek in winter was not a place where options multiplied. Silas raised the subject on a Thursday in January in the kitchen in the way he raised most subjects, directly, without a lot of preamble. "The room off the kitchen is yours if you want it," he said. "Properly. Not for safety. Just as a place to be." He paused. "Caleb wants you close. You know that. And it would make more sense for you to be here than to be making the ride every other day in January weather." Evelyn looked at him across the table. "What does that mean for us?" "It means you have a room," he said. "It doesn't mean anything else unless we decide it does. Separately." "Those are very careful words." "I'm a careful man." He looked at his coffee cup. "I know what I want. I'm not sure it's fair to push for it right now, given everything you've just come through. You need time that belongs to you, not to a situation or a legal fight or—" He stopped. "Not to me." She looked at him for a long moment. Silas Boone, she had learned over these months, was a man who said what he meant and meant what he said, and had the particular difficulty of people like that. He was rarely misunderstood, but he was often underestimated because plain-spoken men in a world that confuses eloquence with depth get written off by people who aren't paying attention. She had been paying attention. "I've had 4 years of time that belonged only to me," she said. "Not by choice, but I know what it is. I don't need more of it to know that it's not what I want." She was quiet for a beat. "What I need is slow, not separate. Slow." He looked up. "Slow," he said. "Yes." She held his gaze. "Can you do that?" Something moved through his face that was not quite a smile but was related to one. The expression of a man who has been holding something carefully for a long time and is being told he can set it down. "I've been doing slow since October," he said. "I've got practice." Oh. Caleb did not fully understand what a court ruling was, but he understood outcomes, and the outcome he perceived was that his mother was now at the ranch every morning when he came downstairs, and that she was there most evenings when Dutch brought him in from the barn, and that this was simply how things were now. He adapted to it with the uncomplicated pragmatism of children, who have not yet learned to require logical consistency from the world as a precondition for accepting it. He did ask, one morning in February while Evelyn was helping him with his coat buttons. He was capable of doing them himself, but preferred assistance, whether she was going to stay forever. She was quiet for a moment. "I'm going to try very hard to," she said. He considered this. "Why only try?" "Because people don't always get to keep the things they want to keep," she said, "even when they try. That's just true. But trying hard is what you can control, so that's what I'm going to do." He looked at her with the jury face. "That's a grown-up answer." "You asked a grown-up question." He seemed to find this fair. He went out to help Dutch with the horses, and Evelyn stood in the kitchen doorway and watched him go, the way she still sometimes stopped in the middle of ordinary moments and held them, not dramatically, not with the weight of everything that had been lost, but carefully, the way you hold something you know the value of. Oh, March brought mud and then the first real warmth, and with the warmth came the work. The ranch had not fallen apart in the years Silas had managed it alone. He was too meticulous for that, but there were things that had been deferred and things that needed 2 people and things that simply ran better with more hands. Evelyn had spent 4 years reading about ranching in a locked room in Connecticut, which was not the same as knowing how to do it, but it was a better foundation than most people started with, and she was not a person who was too proud to learn what she didn't know. She learned to read the weather signs that Dutch had been accumulating for 30 years, the way certain clouds sat on the mountain line, the smell of the air before a late storm, the behavior of the horses in the hour before the temperature dropped. She learned which section of fence needed watching after heavy rain and which water trough was prone to freezing despite being in a southern-facing position, and why. She made mistakes. She misjudged the timing on a supplement delivery and ended up short for 2 weeks, and she had an argument with Dutch about the proper way to winterize the East chicken coop that she later conceded she had lost on the merits. She was not good at everything. She was steadily competent at most things, and what she lacked in experience she made up for in the kind of attention that comes from someone who is deeply aware that she arrived late to her own life and is not willing to waste what remains of it. The argument with Dutch, it should be noted, became one of his favorite stories. He told it at supper and at the feed store, and once, inexplicably, to the deputy sheriff Cole Ferris when they ran into each other near the creek. His version involved more dramatic disagreement than Evelyn remembered, and she told him so, and he said his memory was excellent, and she said his memory was creative, and Silas said nothing because watching the two of them argue was one of the more entertaining things that had happened to the ranch in years. Dutch, who had been right about most things, had been right about Evelyn. He had been right before Silas admitted it, and before Silas could see it clearly. He bore this knowledge with dignity and only occasionally used it to win unrelated arguments. Spring also brought letters. Two of them, arriving in March within a week of each other, from women whose names Evelyn did not recognize, but whose situations she understood immediately. The first was from a woman in Vermont whose sister was being held in a private facility in Massachusetts under documentation that sounded, in its particulars, very much like the documentation that had imprisoned Evelyn. The woman had heard, through a chain of connections she described as complicated, and which involved Catherine Marsh and a women's organization in Hartford, that there was a woman in Wyoming who had fought that kind of arrangement and won, and she was asking if there was any advice to be given. The second letter was from a woman in Pennsylvania who was in the situation itself, being held, or recently escaped. The letter was unclear on the timeline, and who had addressed it to Edmund Rourke at his Cheyenne office, but who had included at the end of the letter a line asking if the woman in Wyoming would be willing to write back. Evelyn sat with both letters for a long time. She sat with them in the kitchen on a Thursday morning with her coffee and the sound of Caleb outside somewhere asking Dutch a question about something. And she thought about what she was willing to do and what she was capable of and how much of her own recovering self she could extend toward other people's crises. She was not, she knew, unlimited. She was still in the process of putting herself back together in ways that were real and needed tending. There were mornings still when she woke up before dawn with the specific fear that had lived in her body for 4 years. The fear that the situation was not resolved, that someone was coming, that the walls were still close. The fear was not as frequent as it had been. It was still real when it arrived. She wrote back to both letters. To the Vermont woman, she wrote carefully and practically. Names of lawyers, what documentation to gather, what evidence tended to carry weight, and what did not. She did not dramatize her own experience or make promises about outcomes. She told the truth, which was that the system was difficult and slow and imperfect, and that none of that meant it was impossible. To the Pennsylvania woman, she wrote something different, shorter. She told her that she had been in a similar situation and that she had gotten out. She told her that getting out was not the end of anything, but the beginning of the part that required a different kind of work. She told her that the different kind of work was worth doing. She asked if she needed specific help and said she would do what she could. She showed both letters to Silas before she sent them. He read them without comment, and then he said, "You're going to keep doing this." "Maybe," she said, "if people keep writing." "They will," he said. "Word gets out." He handed the letters back. "I'll have Dutch build a proper desk in the spare room. You can't keep writing on the kitchen table." She looked at him. He looked at her in the level, direct way he had. "This is useful work," he said, "and you're good at it, so we'll make room for it." She did not say thank you. He had told her twice not to thank him. She understood now what he meant by it, that between people who were genuinely building something together, gratitude for basic support was too thin a response. What he was offering was not a favor. It was just how things were going to be. "All right," she said. "All right," he said. "But They married in April, on a Saturday, in front of a modest assembly of people who had watched enough of the story to feel they had some stake in how it ended. It was not a large ceremony. Evelyn had not wanted large. She had arrived in a wedding dress 9 months earlier, and the symbolism of that arrival was not lost on her, and she had no intention of repeating the scale of the original wedding, which had been planned more by her father than by herself, and which she thought of as belonging to a different version of her life. What she wanted was simple and specific, and she said so. She wanted Caleb standing beside her. She wanted Clara Holt and Molly Greer there because they had been present in the ways that counted. She wanted Dutch, who had earned his place in this story more than once. She wanted Catherine Marsh, who had come back to Harlow Creek in March for reasons she described as temporary, but which did not appear to be. She wanted Rourke, who made the trip from Cheyenne and who, when asked, said he attended client weddings only under exceptional circumstances, and that this qualified. The ceremony was held in the Lindstrom front room, which was the largest private space in Harlow Creek, and which smelled of pine and dried lavender, and the wood smoke of a fire that had been going since morning. There were no flowers, because it was early April in Wyoming, and the flowers were not yet cooperative. There were candles, because Clara Holt had brought them, and their light was warm and slightly uneven and entirely right for the occasion. Caleb wore his good coat, which had been replaced since winter and actually fit him now. He stood beside his mother with his hands clasped in front of him, trying to look serious and occasionally succeeding. He was 6 years old, and he understood the general shape of what was happening, that his family was becoming official, that the word family was being attached to the thing that already existed. And this satisfied him in the same deep, uncomplicated way that it had satisfied him since October, when he had seen his mother on a train platform and simply known what he knew. Silas and Evelyn stood across from each other and said the words that needed saying. They did not say them the way people say words they have rehearsed. Evelyn had written and discarded 3 different versions of what she wanted to say, and eventually said something she had not written down, which was more honest and less polished and exactly right. Silas said what he said in the direct, plain-spoken way he said everything, and it landed with the weight of things that are meant exactly as stated. There was a moment near the end when Caleb reached up and put his hand in Evelyn's, without ceremony or announcement, just the automatic reaching of a child toward a parent, and she held on, and the room, the small, warm, imperfect room full of people who had not always known each other and who had arrived at this moment through a variety of difficult routes, was quiet in the way that real things make a room quiet. Not because something beautiful had happened, because something true had. But the years that followed were not an answer to everything that had been broken. That is not how it works, and Evelyn, who had more reason than most to want a clean ending, had become too honest a person to pretend otherwise. Her father was investigated formally in the summer of 1892. The investigation was lengthy and unpleasant and produced consequences that were real but incomplete, charges that were pled down, penalties that were significant by some measures and insufficient by others. The Connecticut facility was closed permanently. Dr. Voss lost her license and died the following year without having faced criminal charges, which Evelyn held without ceremony in the complicated place where she kept things that were not resolved but could not be changed. Aldous Harper died in 1895, while the remaining legal matters were still being processed. He died of a heart condition in his own home in Boston, attended by his own doctor. He did not reach out to Evelyn before he died. She did not expect him to. She did not spend significant time expecting things from him because she had learned at great cost that expecting things from people who have demonstrated who they are is a waste of a life. She did not grieve him, she did not celebrate his death either, because she was not that kind of person, and because grief and celebration both require a relationship, and what she had with Aldous Harper had never been a relationship. It had been a power arrangement that had failed, and then an obstacle that had been cleared, and then a chapter that was finished. She told Caleb, when he was old enough to understand most of it, the truth about what had happened. Not all at once. She parceled it out over years, in the way that good parents tell difficult truths, giving the child enough to understand without giving him more than he could carry at his current age. He was a serious child who became a serious young man, not easily rattled, with his mother's quality of paying close attention and his father's quality of sitting with things before responding to them. He asked, when he was 13, if she was angry at his grandfather. She thought about it for a real moment, not a performed one. "I was," she said, "for a long time. And then I was mostly tired of being angry, because he was getting the benefit of all that energy, and I was getting nothing from it, so I put it down." She looked at her son. "That's not forgiveness. I want to be clear about that. I didn't forgive him. I just decided he wasn't worth the carrying weight." Caleb nodded slowly. "Is that wrong?" she asked. "No," he said. "I think it sounds right." He paused. Dutch says something like that. He says you put down what you don't need and carry what you do. "Dutch says a lot of things," Evelyn said. "He's usually right." "I know," she said. "Don't tell him that. His head's already large." The ranch grew. Not overnight, not through any dramatic stroke of luck, but through the accumulated work of people who knew what they were doing and were willing to stay with it through the years that were bad, as well as the years that were good. Silas expanded the cattle operation in 1893 with the help of a loan from the territorial bank that Evelyn had helped him calculate and present. Her 4 years of reading practical books having turned out to be genuinely useful in ways neither of them had anticipated when she first mentioned it. The south pasture fence was replaced in sections over 2 summers. A proper barn was built in 1894, larger than the old one, built with help from 3 neighboring ranchers who came for a week and whose own fences and roofs and barns had been helped along by Silas over previous years. That was the thing about the frontier that had surprised Evelyn most. Not the hardship, which she had prepared herself for and found to be more or less as advertised, but the exchange of it. The way people here kept account not in money, but in work, in presence, in showing up when someone needed the labor. It was not without its complications. Frontier communities had their politics and their grievances and their people who kept grudges past the point of usefulness. But at its core was a practicality that had a kind of decency to it, a recognition that no one survived alone out here, and that this made certain behaviors simply impractical. She wrote letters for 3 years before she stopped counting them. Women in several states, and then women who had heard from those women, and eventually women she had never met from places she had never been, who somehow knew her name and what she had done and wrote asking for help. Rourke, who had handled the legal end of 2 more guardianship challenges in the Wyoming Territory by 1894, said she was creating case law through the force of correspondence, which was not something most people managed. She did not think of it as creating case law. She thought of it as writing back when people wrote to her, which seemed like the basic decency of the situation. She had received one letter that had changed everything, in the shape of a sealed envelope slid under the kitchen table in October of 1891. It did not seem unreasonable to write back. Catherine Marsh stayed in Harlow Creek. The temporary nature of her return visit in March became, by summer, simply where she lived, aided by the fact that Clara Holt had decided she wanted a full-time assistant and had made Catherine an offer that was not large but was genuine. Catherine had, it emerged, a considerable talent for altering clothing in ways that were structurally sound rather than merely decorative, something she attributed to having spent her childhood in a household where things were mended rather than replaced, and the shop became more successful with her in it. She never testified again. She had done it once, and that was enough. What she did instead was quieter, and in some ways more lasting. She became the person who the women who came through Harlow Creek with complicated situations were directed toward. The person who sat across from someone in difficult circumstances and said, without flourish, "Here is what I know, and here is what can be done." She had the quality that made people trust her quickly. She never pretended things were simpler than they were. She and Evelyn remained close in the way that people who have been through specific things together remain close. Not in daily conversation, not in the performed closeness of people who want to seem like they have deep friendships, but in the way that when one of them had something real to say, the other was who she said it to. Caleb grew into himself over the years the way good people do, not without difficulty, not without the years that were harder than others, but with a fundamental quality that had been there since he was 5 years old and had pointed at a woman in a wrecked wedding dress and simply known what he knew. He was steady, he paid attention. He was genuinely kind in the unsentimental, practical way of people raised on the frontier, where kindness usually meant doing something rather than saying something. He took over management of a significant portion of the ranch's operations by the time he was 17, not because Silas could not handle it, but because he was capable and interested, and Silas was not a man who held things close when sharing them was the right choice. Father and son worked well together in the way of people who do not feel the need to perform their relationship. They argued about methods and sometimes about decisions, and they were both too stubborn to yield quickly. And they usually arrived at something better than either of them had started with. He asked his father once, when they were mending the south fence in a summer that was hotter than usual, what he had thought when Evelyn walked off the train. Silas worked on the fence for a moment. "I thought the world had stopped making sense," he said. And then I thought it was making a different kind of sense than I'd been expecting." Caleb considered this, the way he considered most things, with the serious, patient attention that was his mother's and the deliberate quiet that was his father's, both things living in him without conflict. "Were you glad she came back?" Silas looked at the fence. Not right away, he said honestly. Right away, I was mostly terrified. Of what? Of what it meant. Of getting it wrong again. He fitted the wire. Terrified of hoping, mostly. Hoping's harder than not hoping, once you've done the not hoping for a while and figured out how to live with it. Caleb was quiet for a moment. But you hoped anyway. Eventually, Silas said. She gave me enough to work with. They finished the fence in a companionable silence, and then they rode back to the house in the long amber light of a Wyoming summer evening. And when they came through the gate, Evelyn was on the porch with a cup of coffee and her eyes on the horizon, which was what she did sometimes in the evenings, just looked at the space of it, the enormous horizontal sky, the way the light moved across the grass, as if she was still, after all these years, grateful for the fact of being somewhere she could see that far. She looked over when they came through the gate. Fence? She said. Fixed, Silas said. South section's been needing it since May, she said. I know, he said. I told you in May. I know that too. She looked at him with the expression that was not quite exasperated and not quite amused, the one that had become one of his favorite things about her face. Get cleaned up, she said. Supper's in 20 minutes. Wow. There's a thing that happens when a life is rebuilt from serious damage, not a thing that looks the way stories tend to make it look, with clear before and after and the sense that the worst part was a passage to be gotten through rather than a thing that leaves permanent marks. The marks stay. The grief stays. In its reduced and more manageable forms. The years that were lost remain lost, and no amount of good years after them returns what they took. Evelyn knew this. She had known it since December of 1891, sitting in a Wyoming courthouse waiting for a ruling that would give her back her name and her son and her legal existence. Even then, even winning, she had known that what she was winning was not restoration. It was continuation, a chance to continue a life that had been interrupted, in a form that would never be exactly what it would have been if the interruption had not happened. That is a harder thing to want than restoration. Restoration promises the original thing, unchanged. Continuation promises only itself, the next day, and the work of that day, and the life that is built out of next days piled up over time, marked by everything that has been true, including the terrible parts. What she had found in the years after the courthouse and the wedding and Clara Holt's borrowed candlelight in the desk that Silas had Dutch build in the spare room, what she had found was that continuation, entered into honestly, was enough, was more than enough most days, was the actual thing, as opposed to the idealized version that she might have had if Aldous Harper had been a different man, and September of 1887 had been a different month. This was not a comforting thought exactly. It was a real one. She had stopped needing comfortable thoughts somewhere around the second year in Connecticut, when she realized that comfortable thoughts were not available and that she would have to find a way to function without them. What she had found instead was that real thoughts, honest ones, even when they were hard, were sustaining in a way that comfort was not. Real thoughts gave you something to stand on. Comfort was just something to sit in, and you could not sit forever, and the frontier did not, in any case, offer much in the way of sitting. She had told Caleb this, in some form, over the years, not as a lesson delivered, but as a way of living that he could observe and take what he wanted from it. She was not certain what he took. Children take what they take, and it is often not what you intended to give, which is its own kind of lesson. On an evening in October, 15 years after the train had come into Harlow Creek Station, with a woman in a wrecked dress on its second car, Evelyn stood on the porch of the Boone Ranch and watched the sun go down over the Wyoming prairie. She was 41 years old and looked it honestly, not worn out, but settled into the shape of a life that had been lived rather than managed. There were lines at the corners of her eyes and at the edges of her mouth that were the lines of a person who had spent years in the sun and the cold and had laughed more in the second half of her life than in the first half. Her hair had some gray in it at the temples. Her hands, which had been soft when she arrived, were not soft now. Silas was inside somewhere. She could hear him moving through the house with the particular quality of presence that a person develops when they have been moving through the same space for long enough that the house knows them. They had learned, over the years, to occupy the same space without commentary. A companionable silence that was not empty but full of the accumulated small knowledge of one person about another, the kind that only time produces and that no amount of intensity can substitute for. Caleb was at his own place now, a property 2 miles east that he had built out of his own savings and Silas's land, married to a young woman from the Lindstrom family who had her grandmother's forthright manner and her own considerable opinions about cattle management, which made her and Caleb well matched in the ways that matter, and occasionally loud about it, which also made them well matched. Came for supper on Sundays. He had been doing this since he moved out, without being asked, and without making a ceremony of it, just showing up, the way he had shown up since the age of 5 with his certainties, and his rock collection, and his willingness to hold a person's hand in a fence line when the afternoon was hard. He was his mother's son in some ways, and his father's in others, and himself in most, which was exactly how it should be. The sun was doing what the Wyoming sun did at this time of year, going slowly, lavishly, turning the prairie a color that had no precise name, something between gold and rust and the memory of both. The mountains to the west caught it last and held it longest, the way mountains do, and Evelyn stood and watched the light move across the land she had read about in a locked room in Connecticut and had thought about every morning as a thing she was returning to. She had returned to it. This was the plain fact of the matter, and she had long since stopped needing it to be more than a plain fact. She had returned. She had built something here. She had done the work, the legal work, the land work, the slower and more difficult work of two people rebuilding a relationship from the parts that had survived its destruction and the new parts they had grown since. None of it had been easy. None of it had been clean. Some of it had been actively ugly. There had been a period in 1893 when she and Silas had had a 6-week argument about a financial decision that was really about something older and harder, and they had eventually arrived at the truth of it together and resolved it and moved on. And that had been one of the most important things that had ever happened between them, though it would not look like much from the outside. That was the thing about the important things. They rarely looked like much from the outside. The door opened behind her, and Silas came out with 2 cups of coffee and handed her one without asking if she wanted it, because after 15 years he knew whether she wanted coffee in the evening, and she wrapped her hands around the cup the way she had wrapped them around every cup since the first cold October morning in his kitchen, because the warmth was still something she was glad to have. He stood beside her, not touching, just present, looking out at the same light. "Dutch's knee is predicting snow by the end of the week," he said. "Dutch's knee has been predicting snow since September. It's October. It'll be right eventually." She smiled at the horizon. They stood in the quiet for a while, the two of them, in the particular ease of people who have stopped needing to fill the silence because the silence is theirs and it fits. The light finished its slow exit. The first stars appeared in the east, where the sky was already deep blue and getting darker. "Do you ever think about what it would have looked like," Evelyn said, "if it had gone differently, if he'd been a different kind of man?" Silas was quiet for a moment. "Sometimes," he said. "Less than I used to." "I used to think about it constantly," she said. "What the years would have been. What Caleb would have been like if I'd been there." She paused. "I don't think about it much anymore." "What changed?" She looked at the stars appearing one by one as the sky finished deciding to be night. "This is the life," she said. "The one that happened. The other one only exists as a thought, and thoughts aren't. They're not something you can live in." She turned the coffee cup in her hands. "This is where I am. These are the years I got. I'd rather be here for them than somewhere else in my head." He looked at her. The specific look he had, direct, unhurried, the look of a man giving his full attention to something that deserves it. "Yeah," he said. "Same." The night settled in around the ranch the way Wyoming nights settle in, thoroughly, without apology, with the vast and indifferent beauty of a sky too large to be anything but honest. The animals were quiet in the barn. The house was warm behind them. Somewhere 2 miles east, there was a light in Caleb's window. The woman who had stepped off a train in a wrecked dress with nothing but a sealed letter and the refusal to accept that what had been taken could not be recovered. She stood on this porch under this sky, and she was here, and she was known, and she had built something that the years ahead would continue, and the years behind had made possible, in the complicated and imperfect and entirely real way that things are made possible by everything that has been survived. It was not the life she had planned. It was the life she had fought for, which turned out to be the better thing. And the frontier that had seemed once like the end of the world, turned out to be simply where the rest of it began.